Alright folks, today I want to talk some more about bronze and why it's fascinating. If you're not fascinated by it, perhaps that's simply because you don't know enough about it yet. So this, of course, has a special place because it's the first metal in history that was in widespread use for weapons and armor. Now, copper was used for quite a while before that, and it was used for tools and some weapons as well, but bronze really allowed metal armor in ways that copper doesn't, and it became iconic. Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, the great civilizations of antiquity, were really built on bronze to a large extent, and the Bronze Age lasted for a long time, roughly 2,000 years if you go by the earliest start in areas like the Aegean and the Levant, for instance. Depends where you look. Some places in Europe, like Britain for example, entered the Bronze Age a lot later, like Scandinavia did as well. People sometimes overestimate how soft bronze is. Of course, it's a lot softer than steel, but so is iron. So is even mild steel compared to high carbon steel. But you can harden bronze. I'll talk more about that later. And that makes it significantly more useful. But iron is easier to acquire because you only need one material. For bronze, you need copper and tin. Copper is fairly easy to find, tin not so much. People had to engage in long-distance trade to acquire tin and be able to make bronze. And it's still in use nowadays. For example, for bearings, because of the low friction that bronze has with other metals, and also its load-bearing capacity. It's also used for tools in environments that have a high risk for explosions, because bronze hammers, for example, don't create sparks when you strike other metals. So that makes it safe around volatile gases and fire hazards, etc. And of course, it's also still used for sculptures and jewelry. Speaking of jewelry, we've got the perfect sponsor for today's video. The folks at Viking Jewelry sent me this badass ring here, and I did not expect it to be this well made. I mean, that sounds kind of bad, but what I mean is, it looked really nice in the picture, but when I actually got it, I was really impressed by just how detailed it is. It's just very intricate, super clean cast. It's extremely smooth on the inside, very comfortable. These are made in Ukraine, and they come in this pretty box here, even with a wax sealed note. I haven't actually broken the wax seal yet. Hi Skall, we hope that this Wegvisir ring will suit you perfectly and guide you on your way to life. It's an honor. We're extremely proud that you're wearing it with all our best feelings. Sincerely, Alice Loic, if I read that correctly, and the Viking team. So, very awesome. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much, guys. And I figured it would fit very well in this video because it illustrates one of the things that I really like about bronze, and that's just how pretty it is. I mean, just look at that. That's beautiful, isn't it? And I'm generally not much into wearing jewelry, but I might just start now because I really like this ring. It's very well made, and something about large rings. So the Wegvisir, by the way, is a symbol that appears in the Huld manuscript from the 19th century. It's technically unclear whether this was already used during the Viking Age, but, it's it fits within the general Viking art style. Wegvisir translates to something that shows the way, so it's a magical sign that's supposed to help you orient yourself and get through storms and bad weather, etc. So they've also provided 2 codes, which will be linked down below. One gives you 30% off on this ring, and the other gives you 20% off on everything else in the store. So this jewelry is definitely something I can get behind. And, bronze jewelry in general, I've always liked. I generally prefer it over silver because just of the color. It is a really appealing, kind of dark, earthen color, if you will. It's got one disadvantage over silver, and that is that it can, over time, can tarnish and can develop kind of a greenish color, and it can also stain your fingers and make them either black or green. But you can seal it by coating it with something like Protector Clear, for example, or even just clear nail polish. That's definitely something I would recommend. Speaking of discoloration and corrosion, copper and copper alloys like bronze generally corrode at a slower rate than iron. Bronze tends to quickly develop a patina, which is copper oxide, which acts as a protective layer. And then all you get is surface corrosion. It doesn't eat deeply into the material the way rust does on iron. Although there is a thing called bronze disease, which is destructive, unlike a patina. So the process is still not fully understood, apparently, but it involves a reaction between chloride and water. So it creates hydrochloric acid that then eats away at the material, and then the indentations and holes caused by the acid can then fill up with green fuzz, as it's called. Technical term, I suppose. So that can very much break down bronze and corrode it, but in general it does pretty well over time. I studied archaeology for several semesters between 2003 and 5, I think, and I saw quite a number of finds, visited a number of museums, and looked at the archaeological record of finds from the Bronze Age and Iron Age. And generally, as soon as the Iron Age comes around, you have kind of a dip in finds, material finds, because not as much was preserved. Iron tends to just be eaten up by rust very substantially, and you need favorable conditions for it to be preserved well. Whereas bronze, even under fairly adverse conditions, can last pretty well. So you've got a lot of bronze swords and daggers and various other artifacts from that are like 3,000 years old that are still in remarkably good condition. All you would need to do is clean them up and they would still be usable. Whereas iron just loses its structural integrity pretty quickly. You can restore it too in a lot of cases, but it's just more material made of bronze that is well preserved. Even in seawater, which is a terribly corrosive medium, copper and bronze last remarkably well compared to iron and carbon steel, which really don't fare very well commonly. And then of course there's a different making process. You create bronze artifacts by melting bronze and casting it in a mold. You can cast iron, but that makes it unsuitable for swords. You have to forge it to be to have the kind of strength that you need and toughness in a sword. Cast iron is very, very brittle. Also, bronze melts at 60% of the temperature required to melt iron. So it is a bit easier to do that. And this also makes it perfectly recyclable. Let's say a sword breaks into 2 pieces or 3 or however many, and you want to repair it. You can weld a steel blade back together or iron, but that's always going to be a potential weak spot right there. Whereas with bronze, you can melt it down and recast it. And especially if you have a reusable mold, you can basically make a number of completely identical swords, identical aside from the hand finishing. So you can basically mass produce bronze swords, at least, depending on the casting method. There are several different methods. There's also the lost wax casting method, which has its own advantages. So what you do basically is you carve the object that you want out of wax, which of course gives you a lot of control over it. Wax is very soft, malleable, so it's very easy to shape, and you can make it pretty intricate. It's then covered in clay, which is heated up to melt the wax, and then you've got the hollow cavity into which you can pour the bronze. There's a number of other casting methods. You have a lot of different options, really, for making bronze items. And then for swords, there is the work hardening, which is a crucial process to refine the edges. So you hammer them, which draws them out for one, makes them thinner. So that's a form of sharpening in and of itself. But what the work hardening, also called cold working, also does is it creates irregularities within the crystalline structure of the material. So those are called dislocations. And the plastic deformation, meaning a permanent distortion in the material that you get from hammering it, then causes these dislocations to move, and it also creates new dislocations in the material. They then interact and bind up, and they prevent further plastic deformation. So then the material can respond to stress with elastic deformation as opposed to plastic. Elastic deformation means that it will change shape and then return to its original shape once the stress is gone. So if you take a fairly soft wire or strip of metal and you keep bending it, it's going to get harder to a certain point, and then if you keep doing it, eventually it's going to break, because at that point you introduce fractures. So you're going to have little cracks, and eventually the material will break. So yeah, with enough stress, eventually this will break, of course. But just like with steel, you have this compromise. On the one hand, you want the edge to be as hard as possible so that it stays sharp for long and doesn't just bend and otherwise deform. But otherwise, you also don't want it to break and chip, etc. So there are ways of optimizing that in bronze. So it's a really fascinating process. Like it's not easy to make a bronze sword in particular, or really any bronze object. So I have a tremendous respect for bronze workers, just like any metal workers really. But this is definitely a different process compared to iron and steel. And finally, of course, the look and the color. This is something that I really like about bronze. Polished steel can be very nice. Especially pattern welded steel, of course, has its own kind of beauty. But just in terms of color, this is really nice. It looks a lot like red gold, and basically like a sunset. Like the way the color changes when the sun sets and kind of bathes everything more in red. That's kind of what I associate with it. It's a warmer color, and that does affect mood to an extent. I mean, I'm not claiming that by just looking at a bronze blade for a while you will be in a better mood, although it kind of works. But it's just an appealing color, at least to me personally. It's a really nice material, especially when it's highly polished. It looks like a sun by itself, basically. I mean, all metal glints awesomely and mysteriously in the light, but bronze just especially so. Of course, it's got drawbacks. It's substantially softer than steel. As said, it's obsolete for a reason as far as blades are concerned. I would still like to own a bronze folding knife, just for the beauty of it and the novelty. It's not really, it wouldn't be a great everyday carry knife because it would dull pretty quickly compared to modern steels, but there's definitely something about it. Also, it's fairly low maintenance compared to steel blades. Like this one here I've had since 2014? I don't even need to oil it. It's just standing around, and all it does is darken a little bit. I don't know if you can see that here. The tip is just a little bit brighter. It's a little bit more yellow, whereas the rest is darker and more reddish. That's because I had it, for a while I had it displayed standing in like a little styrofoam block with a tip, so the tip wasn't exposed to air. So you can see that's the original color and the rest has darkened. And it can, you know, change appearance over time in kind of interesting ways. Anyway, that's about it for right now. So those are reasons to like bronze, as far as I'm concerned. Hope you found this entertaining and informative. And tell me what you think about bronze. How do you like it? Again, check out the links in the description down below. Also consider supporting me on Patreon and Subscribestar if you're so inclined. And have a good one, folks. Thanks for watching.